Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. Education is seen to be the cornerstone of global development. Then why, after decades and decades of trying to make quality education more accessible, are more than 260 million children out of school in the world? On today's show, we take a closer look at how the educational sector must be strengthened, locally and globally, and what are the modern conditions that are depriving children of gaining the opportunity to be in school. Joining us for this discussion to Professor Samina Yasmeen, who's a sociologist and professor at the University of Western Australia. She joins us from Perth. Also joining us is Mr. Gilbert Van Kerckhove, who's an economist and the author of the book Toxic Capitalism. He joins us from Beijing. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Samina Yasmeen, let me begin with you. Now, global leaders all around the world have set the goal of providing quality, accessible education to all the children in the world by 2030. And yet what we're seeing right now is millions of children being left behind in the system. What macro factors do you think are at play?
I think basically when we set different sort of targets, we have to understand whether or not the essential conditions exist on ground that can help us achieve those targets. But we have looked at this whole education issue for children and even for adults from a global perspective, where we think that if you suggest these targets, somehow they would be met. So it's basically lack of understanding of what happens on ground, and also lack of understanding that you can't just simply promise without sufficient funding to enable those countries where the children can't go to school to actually have their kids be schooled. So it's basically a helicopter type of a vision of education in developing countries without coming into contact with the realities of the developing countries that I think really stops that happening.
Right. And those are important points you've made here. And I'm going to pick up on the point regarding funding. And I'm going to lead with that when I ask Mr. Gilbert. Now, Mr. Gilbert, a report by some of the main leading voices on global education supply, a UN representative, all of these people, they wrote a blog in which they stated that funding globally for education has been falling. Now, it was 13.2 billion in 2018. That's fallen to 13 billion. We're seeing a downwards decline. Why do you think that is? Why are people investing less and less globally into education?
Well, first of all, this is a very, I would say, scary figure you're giving here. I didn't know it was so bad. From two points of view myself, first of all, I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Beijing, and one of the targets we have is to care for children, education, and health-wise. I'm also working on a new book where the issue of education is central. Education is extremely important for the future of any country. Funding, obviously, is a big issue. If today governments spend more money on doing things like our army and other issues, this is, of course, a very wrong move. Another big issue also connected to funding is the quality and the quantity of teachers we can see. In many rural areas in China, for example, it is still very difficult to have enough teachers. We see issues in China, we see issues in Africa. In both regions, the issues are pretty different. For example, here in China, what we have been doing is supplying libraries to the children that are in remote villages, on mountains, very far from anything. We also care about children with disabilities, with poor hearing or visually impaired. These are the typical fields where still education is lagging behind. It's of course also the case in Africa, where roads are bad, and access to the schools, both by the teachers, by the children, is very difficult. So it's very unwise from any government not to invest in the future of their country, being funding education.
Right. And here I want to adopt the perspective of the global economy. Now, You wrote the book Toxic Capitalism, and this is what I want to link to my question here. In this system, development is, of course, the key goal. Why do you think governments are becoming, what is the perspective there? Why are governments becoming more and more inclined, not just globally, but even locally, to slash education budgets? What rhetoric do you think is being employed here?
Well, unfortunately, we see many governments going through very difficult periods. As you see, even in the United States, in Europe, there are issues with level of education and funding. The issues there, of course, are different from places like Africa or Asia or other countries. It is very sad when governments go through a big turmoil, as we see today, that people are talking about immigration, about racism, about many other issues, but they put education on the back burner. I think today we have to wait a little bit that the governments stabilize in many, many countries.
Right. Now, Samina, Yasmeen, what I want to talk about is when we're talking about trying to reduce the number of children out of school, we're often conflating the issue of just getting children into school and quality education. Now, you being an academic, a professor, give us a distinction between how people globally, policymakers, should differentiate both of them, schooling and quality education.
Well, I can't talk about global decision makers, but I can tell you my own experiences and research that we do in terms of getting students. It's not just simply having students sitting in the class or not sitting in the class and listening to it online, but the students who can actually develop the capacity of critical thinking. Basically, what we have focused on is to get them into the class, into the school, and not really done what I think the other speaker is talking about, looking at other ingredients that are needed for teachers who have good quality training so that they know exactly how to promote critical thinking. So I think because we've had such limited vision of what education is all about, which initially started with the capacity to be able to read and write your name, now when we talk about studying and learning and being educated, we're just focusing on numbers, not on the quality. And that's, I would also say, which wasn't really said by the other speaker, is that I think because in a globalized world, we are turning education, and especially tertiary education, into a big global business, then the interest of the countries that previously provided money, that has decreased. Because what they want is young people to come to their countries and pay money for that, rather than be educated in their countries of origin. So overall, there's a lack of true willingness to say, how do we create those conditions on ground that children actually get educated?
Right.
And not just get educated, but get knowledge.
So, Professor Samina, Yasmeen, you are emphasizing on trying to contextualize the situation. And of course, in every region, in every country, the situation is very complex and it varies considerably. So in terms of curriculum and actually imparting education, we do know that the World Bank is one of the largest contributors to educational development and all of this. But when we're talking about international donors, what do you think needs to be kept in mind in terms of designing the curriculum and making sure that it is contextualized to the place in which it is being taught?
I think what's absolutely essential is that donors do not tie their aid for education with certain ways of learning. Because when we think about different environments in which children learn, based upon what they experience, they have different ways of learning. So I think the international donors, including World Bank, needs to engage the local expertise. Now, I'm thinking of an example in Indonesia that one of my colleagues told me that young kids in certain areas, they were sort of being educated just by using iPads. And someone came up with this very funny idea that maybe we should remove the teachers from the classes and give them iPads. Now, I don't agree with this, but I think what he's really saying is that if that's how children are learning, you provide them with that facility.
Right.
If they learn differently, you provide them that facility, but that requires localized knowledge and not a globally standardized view of what education is all about.
Right. Now, Mr. Gilbert, on the flip side of all of this, we're talking about education being localized even when international donors are involved. But at the same time, we do see the world becoming more and more globalized, especially when we're talking about tech experts, many different fields. So how do children become capable of contributing to the global economy? How do you think education should play a role in this?
Well, first of all, the lady professor from Perth, she is very correct in emphasizing localized issues for the teachers. As I also said, it's important that teachers are well remunerated and are also trained. This is a very big issue. If we think about going international, obviously some of the issues have to be improved. I give you one example. In China, many of the smaller schools in the villages, they barely talk about geography. So when you talk with Chinese people, they even don't know where my country Belgium is. They don't know where France is. They have no idea about geography. Of course, the language, like teaching English, is also important to become international. But overall, it's especially the quality of the teachers that is important. Another issue is also to take care of the health of the children. If the children are sick, cannot go to school, if the mothers are sick, are going through a rough time, then also the education suffers. So as Rotary, for example, they pay a lot of attention for the health of the kids, but also the health of the mother in particular.
Right. Professor Samina, just before I let you go now, Mr. Gilbert pointed out a number of key points here. We also talked about how localized knowledge is important, but also to be integrated into the global system because you want to be competitive for the global system. Is there any point in particular that you would like to respond to?
Well, I agree with these ideas because I think once you know the ways of looking at your environment, you can gradually build the capacity. Because really education, and even at a global level, is about developing capacity to be competitive in your own environment or globally. But if you don't give the children the tools with which they can learn how to acquire knowledge, then they would always be not competitive, whether it's in their own environment or globally. So I think we really need to focus, one, on the funding of these institutions, two, as Mr. Gilbert rightly pointed out, training of the teachers, and then three, also understanding that if we're talking about poor children who don't go to school, and that's the reality, then what are the other factors that are preventing them from doing that? And in that, I just want to sort of point out that my late mother, she, in fact, years ago introduced this idea that government schools should be quote-unquote adopted by people so that they can provide the facilities for these people and the children. Just simple food, something that makes it important for them to be in the class. Once that condition is made, then children have an incentive, parents have an incentive to send their kids, and then if the teachers are also fed and trained, then I think we have the basic mixture. But without looking at that and just simply coming up with certain numbers and say by year 2030 we would achieve that, we're just contributing to a narrative of being educated, but not really creating education.
Right. And that's a very, very important point that you mentioned here. Thank you so much, Professor Samina Yasmeen, for joining us and talking to us from Perth. So, Mr. Gilbert, Professor Samina Yasmeen pointed out something very important, that we're talking about global targets, but we're not really digging deep into trying to understand how children should be equipped to deal with global challenges such as critical thinking. And it's not just important for children to be in classrooms, but to actually gain education. Now, I want to lead this question off and talk about youth unemployment globally. The ILO estimates that unemployment rate stands at 13% for young adults. Now, give us a sense of the economic cost of trying to undertake education, not just primary, but secondary, and how that is going globally for the youth who are so largely unemployed.
Well, unemployment obviously is a very big issue. We see in many poor countries where the unemployment of the young people is extremely high. This is an extremely dangerous situation because it leads to crime of all kinds. Again, the governments have the responsibility to do something about that. Like was said already, funding the schools, but also the teachers. As for the curriculum, I think, as we both stressed here, localization is very important. We also have to refrain from imposing, I would say, political views through helping schools or even religious goals. So this should be left to the decision of the country. We should localize, in other words. As to become better for the employment market, I think we have to stress that very often what is taught to the children is not always what the children need to find the right profession. I think very often people always look just at universities, but learning some skills that can be immediately used in the country, that can be a plumber, it can be a construction worker, it can be a nurse. Those are things that people need. And very often this is not looked at carefully.
Right. On that point, I'd also like to introduce Professor Dora Marinova, who is a professor of sustainability at the Curtin University. She joins us from Perth. Thank you so much, Professor Marinova, for joining us. Now, what we're talking about is a disconnect between the demand and the supply of educated professionals. And of course, this does go back into the educational system. We talk about brain drains, we talk about many different issues. How do you think education should be contextualized, but also adjusted to the specific demands and needs of the economy and the market?
It's a very interesting question. Obviously, it depends what the market is. Because are you talking about extreme situations when you have underprivileged people who have been exposed to discrimination or who haven't had access to education for a prolonged period of time? Are you talking to mainstream students that need to be educated? What I want to say is that these days, particularly with telecommunication technologies, there are no empty spaces, including in the field of education. We often see initiatives taken by the global community by filling in vacuums provided by shortage of funding or shortage of skills. And that's coming through mechanisms such as crowdfunding or even by people just volunteering to offer certain types of education online through free courses or through deliberately developed programs for particular sections of society. I've been working very closely with the government of Bangladesh in the area of sustainability because the government of Bangladesh is highly committed to the achievement of sustainable development goals. And the government has experienced severe problems with the refugees, from the Rohingya Muslim refugees, for a situation where they were not prepared, they didn't have the funds, nothing. It wasn't expected. So situations like this become a global responsibility, and this is a very important point that I want to make. It's not only the country where these people have been displaced to; it's also the global community. Education provides stability, some sense of security, and from what I understand, the Asian Women's University, which was established back probably about 20 years ago, has been able to provide some support through educational pathways for the Rohingya Muslim women in particular, so that they can have opportunities in the ready-made garments in Bangladesh or in any other field that they want to pursue. So we have these formal channels, but we also have a lot of voluntary, informal, new ways of providing education.
Right. Professor Dora Marinova, you talked about the refugees in particular, and that's a discussion we're going to carry forward during the second half of the show as well. But you're talking about funding options and more creative ways of funding education. But Mr. Gilbert, I want to go and pick up on this point. Doesn't this reflect a market failure? When individuals have to seek options from private individuals, it's great that people are becoming generous. It's great that they're giving donations. But what at large is the problem with the economic system when it fails to provide such a basic necessity?
You're perfectly right. You're making actually a very, very important point. If people like us from Rotary, we have to go and help schools, we have to assist that the teachers become better. There's something wrong in the system because this should not be left to an NGO or a charity. It should come from the government. So it would be ideal situation that people like Rotary do not have to do anything in terms of education. Unfortunately, many governments, as was said already this evening, they fail to understand the importance of education. And just to come back on the employment market, I would call, as I already mentioned, somehow vocational schools. Vocational schools are extremely important because they don't require many years of teaching, but provide, in many cases, immediate employment. I have been visiting many huge vocational universities in China. They have like 20,000, 30,000 students. And these are all vocational schools. These people go out of the school, immediately they have a job. And the same can be applied in many, many other countries.
Right. That's an interesting point you're making about how vocational education does need to be looked into. It can be used as a system to correct what we're seeing in the process of providing education. But Mr. Gilbert, another thing I do want to point out on this market failure thing, and I'll first ask Professor Marinova this question. Do you feel like the educational system globally has geared itself to becoming a money-making business, and that's why we're seeing so many people being left behind?
Absolutely. We're seeing corporatization of universities everywhere across the world. They're now being run as corporations. Same is happening in the private sector with primary schools, secondary schools, and you're absolutely correct that there is a responsibility for government because of the market failure. But there is also another type of responsibility, which we, in the field of sustainability, we describe this as transformational failure, because you don't want the educational system only to continue with the business as usual. You actually want to see transformation and transitioning to new technologies. You don't want to replace only accountants with new accountants or particular professions that we exist with people who have exactly the same skills. We actually want to transform the economy. And this is where the market is not so easy to take leadership. This is where the government needs to provide the support when it comes to areas that are not developed, areas that are underfunded by the private enterprise. And we've seen this with things such as adoption of telecommunication technologies. We're seeing this with deployment of renewable energy, where you need some active engagement of the government in providing the education and the skills to transform the economy from an old industrialization-based model to a model that is more attuned to the priorities of the 21st century. So the government definitely has a place and to transform the way we provide education.
Right. We seem to agree on this point, all three of us, that the government does indeed have a very important responsibility. Mr. Gilbert, I want to refer to this policy brief that was published in the World Economic Forum that talks about one of the solutions in trying to close this financial gap we see in the market when it talks about education and providing funds for it. It talks about harnessing private capital for it, getting private businesses on board. But I'm going to put that same question to you. Wouldn't that exacerbate the problem when we're talking about educational sectors becoming a money-making business?
Yes, I think that all the ladies already stressed this point, and I fully agree with them. As a matter of fact, we always come back to the same situation. We want the governments to act more. Then we can all be accused of being socialist, because in countries like the USA in particular, the whole education system is extremely commercialized. And if you ask the government to do more, then you are branded a socialist, a communist, whatever, which is completely wrong. So I think in terms of private investment, it is always very tricky. If you leave it up too much to the private sector, then of course many kids will be left out. What I see in China, the universities I mentioned previously, vocational universities, they were actually funded by private Chinese groups with a very nice funding. And I think those private companies understood there is a future. They are training, for example, people in the food and beverage industry, in the hospitality industry. So that are people who work in hotels, in restaurants alike. And like I said, these people come out of that type of university, they immediately find an employment. So there is some adequate money-making mechanism. But unfortunately, this cannot cover the whole population. So we always come back to square one. The government should do more. We cannot leave it completely to the private sector or to NGOs like Rotary.
Right. Professor Dora Marinova, now coming back to that point that at the end of the day, it's the government that is responsible, I want to talk about more globalized policies that can actually work in this regard. I mentioned at the start of the show that in 2015, world leaders made a pact that they would try to provide quality and accessible education to all children in the world by 2030. But it seems like little is being done to actually achieve that goal. What policies do you feel like can actually make a difference in this case when we're talking about the international community?
Well, education is a human right. So it's something that it should not be an optional thing. It should be provided to every single child, to even every adult who is keen to improve their skills. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, to the ones that you referred to, was an attempt of the global community to actually provide an agenda, and it's told no one should be left behind. And this is what the United Nations, including all the organizations of the United Nations, were putting to the national governments to achieve. However, we are still living under particular national governments which governments can take on board the international agenda or can completely ignore it. I was referring to Bangladesh as a country where that global agenda is completely fully endorsed, and everybody's performance is being assessed by achieving the targets that are set by the international community. However, this is not the case, for example, in other countries. Australia provides reports how we're achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have a very well-developed educational system. However, we still experience this division between those who have and those who have not, or those who can afford and those who cannot afford education. The actual geographical setup of a country is a big factor, and it may be a constraint to providing education. If you live in a remote community, you may not even have access to mobile phone coverage. So you need to go through methods through online radio or even being educated at home. And this is something that we see a lot of people are trying to do, homeschooling, because everybody needs to provide the best opportunities for their children. Right. So it's one thing to have the global agenda, but it's another thing how you can actually impose the global agenda in the circumstances of every particular country or every particular community. I think that there is a big responsibility on government, but also community has to take ownership of some of these problems and fill in some of the gaps. When there is a goodwill and when there is a responsibility to the future generation, there is a role that community also needs to play. And to put it very explicitly, you cannot expect government to have the vision for the future of any country, any community, the same way as the community itself has.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Dora Marinova, for sharing your views and giving us insight into this very important topic. Thank you, Mr. Gilbert Van Kerckhove, for joining us from Beijing. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Now, what we're talking about today is how to make education more accessible around the world. Not just primary education, but secondary education as well. We know at this point in time, more than 260 million children are out of school. This, of course, not just impacts their primary years, but it goes on to impacting their employment opportunities as well. Now we're in conversation with Mr. Ali Reza Yasa, who is the director of Afghans Awareness and Sympathy Association. He also works as an activist in the area of education, protection of refugees' rights, and obligation awareness. He's joining us from Turkey. Thank you so much, Mr. Yasa, for joining us. Also joining us is Mr. Abu Kalam Mohammad Rehan, who is doing his master's degree with a CSC scholarship and researching about 5G antennas. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Rehan, let me begin with you and talk to you about the costs globally for education when we're talking about students who want to complete their graduate and master's degree. Now, we know many children, millions of children from developing parts of the world go to the more developed countries and try to find educational opportunities there. How do you see the state of scholarships and how important do you think it plays in all of this?
Basically, for the higher education, in China, the higher education is the best level because this is an international quality education. And for higher study, we must go various universities. And when the different countries give us the scholarships, and then we can go abroad and we can study in different countries, and we can learn different society and the different culture, different people, and this is very effective for our country, your country, and for every countries. And I think this is more helpful to developing any countries, not only our countries, in develop every people. And here I have seen that there are too many people, they are studying in their country. I am suggesting that try to develop your country by hiring international students for developing yourself and also developing by students.
Right. Mr. Yasa, now we're talking educational attainment, but we know that a large segment of school children, and not just school children, but young adults, are left out of the system. I want to focus specifically on displaced children and refugee children and youths. Now, official figures show that almost 30 million displaced children in the world exist. They are out of school. 75 million children are currently being denied education because they exist in conflict zones. Tell us the complexity of this entire matter, refugee children trying to attain education.
Thank you, Ms. Meshal. It's a global humanitarian crisis when you are talking about 260 million people who are not able to go to school or to the secondary schools. If I talk about specifically about the refugees and crisis who are about the displacement, the people who are not able to go to the school and they do not have access to refugees and displacement, it's not only about one country, especially to all the third world countries who are involving in the war, like Afghanistan, like Syria, like Iraq, like Yemen. You can get a large number of the people who of the children who are not able to go to the school because they do not have the environment to go to the school. So in this case, we need to focus. We need to focus on how we can find a solution.
Mr. Yasa, stay with me. I want to jump back to Mr. Rehan and talk to him about this. Mr. Rehan, now we're talking about children who, of course, are refugee children. It's a complex situation, children who exist in conflict zones. Now, of course, this is unrelatable, but I do want to understand, when you see this underprivileged children, you see children who are completely put out of the system. What do you think needs to be done at a local level to provide them more opportunities?
At the first step, I think their government, if the government take the proper steps, and then they will take the home education they get secondly, we can do the make a primary school, that is family school. I think family school the best, that is mother and father, and who has no mother and father, and that if the our government, any country government, take the steps, there is strictly step for that students, for those people who are in that position. I think government take the proper solution for this problem.
Mr. We have you back here, and you talked about a complicated situation. You talked about how there are many factors at play. We also talked about international donors earlier on in the show. How do you feel like when it comes to refugee children with children in conflict zones, what roles do you think the international community needs to play?
Unfortunately, the humanitarian refugees crisis and displacement is not only about the education. First, because they have lots of any other problems. The first problem, the elementary problems like food, like clothes, like shuttles, they need those things. But after that, the education problem is the secondary kind of problem. So the NGOs, the international organizations like UNHCR, like UN, the UNICEF, they are not focusing at the first time to the education. First, they should feel much more other difficulties, other the problems, and then they can go to the second problem, which is education. Of course, you know the one of the most probably the most problem, the biggest most problem is education. But for refugees, the first problem are some other things that I said.
Right.
But the rules of international organizations, it is we cannot ignore that they are trying.
Mr. Yasa, sorry to interrupt, but what I want to ask you is, when I'm talking about the international role, I understand how the primary things is basic survival for people who have fled from conflict, who have had to leave their homes because of persecution, because of violence, now because of climate change, several factors. I understand survival is the basic thing. But what I want to get to is that we know in the world globally, developed nations are hosting over 80% of the refugees. In terms of this, they are already shouldering a huge amount of burden. What do you think needs to be done by the international community, by developed nations, in order to support them, not just for basic survival, but to help these individuals rehabilitate?
One of the most problem for refugees is peaceful integration. If you made the environment for the refugees to be integrated in new societies in second or third world, the third countries, that time you can focus on the education, which one of the most important thing for this integration is education. But first, you need to focus on how they can live, how they can integrate to the new societies, especially for these placements. They do not have access. Mostly, they do not have access to other facilities like food, like clothes, like other things, and then they will think about the educational. If I talk about the rules of rules of the international or rules of the world about educational in Turkey, which we are living and we are activating here. The rules of the international community is very, very important here. Trying to do something, but first they need to solve the other problems.
Right. Mr. Yasa, I'm going to, since we've run out of time, on that point, thank you so much, Mr. Ali Reza Yasa, for joining us from Turkey, and Mr. Abu Kalam Mohammad Rehan for joining us from China. We have come to the end of our show, but we will be back tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.